Welcome to the Diversity Connector podcast, where we explore the rich tapestry of human experiences. I'm your host, Gertrude Mache, and I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the country on which we meet today. I would also like to pay my respects to elders, past, present, and emerging, and together as we dive into conversations that bridge cultures, challenge stereotypes, and celebrate the unique perspectives each of us brings to the table. Each episode is a journey through stories and insights from a kaleidoscope of voices, each sharing their colorful narrative. Whether you're at home, on the go, or just anywhere in between, you're now part of a community that values understanding, inclusivity, and the beauty of diversity. So plug in your headphones, get comfortable, and let's connect through the power of our shared stories. Welcome, and thank you for joining us on the Diversity Connector podcast. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Diversity Connector. This is Gertrude Mache here in beautiful Melbourne, Australia. And today I am graced with the presence of yet another fascinating guest. Welcome, welcome, welcome to our tribe. Please tell everybody your full name, where you're based, how old you are, and share your story with us today.
Thank you so much, Gertrude, for having me on the podcast. It's a blessing to be here, and it's truly, truly amazing to get to speak to all of you and then all of the listeners as well that are listening to the Diversity Connector podcast. It's fantastic to be here. So my name is Ndaba, or Ndaba Waile-Maphosa. I was born in Zimbabwe. I was born in Gweru, Zimbabwe in the year 1999, which makes me 24. And I grew up in New Zealand. So I'm one of those diaspora babies that kind of were moved over when my family decided to reach out for better things, to seek new opportunities outside of their homeland of Zimbabwe for both the benefit of myself and then my little sibling as well, my little brother, who was born in New Zealand. So I moved to New Zealand in the year of 2000, 2001-ish, near the end of that period of time, which made us one of the first Black people to be around Zimbabwean African people in New Zealand at the time, which was a very interesting situation to grow up in, especially being as young as you are. A lot of my Zimbabwean friends that I met and grew up with, both in Australia and in New Zealand, had moved over around the ages of like 5, 6, some as old as 9 or 10. So for me, I knew I was born outside of New Zealand and I knew I was born in Zimbabwe, but I wasn't as actively connected to the culture by having grown up and gone to the first formative years of school in Zimbabwe the same way some of my other friends and family were, which was quite an experience. Around the age of 9 and 10, I moved to Australia. So we initially moved to Queensland, up north in one of the mining towns called Rockhampton. And then we moved down to Melbourne to finish up my primary, middle school, high school, as I got a bit older. And since then, I've been in Melbourne since 2012, 13. And that's where I finished up high school. That's where I finished up university. And that's where I'm currently studying now to be a digital designer. So what I do now is I'm a multidisciplinary creative, specializing in areas of creative thinking, storytelling, and digital design. So I started off in community radio way back in 2018, a fresh face of 18 and 19 years old, because one of my friends, shout out to Eldrin Naidu, is a fantastic guy, noticed we all had our own different experiences and real voices, both coming from areas of South Africa, Zimbabwe, and just being African kids from different parts of the diaspora. So Eldrin is in South Africa and Zimbabwe. We have people called colored people, which are like essentially they're people they're Black people, but their experiences are significantly different from those of someone like myself, who is someone that was just entirely, he's just both of my parents are black. And then we also had Jenna Green, who is someone from the UK, who is half Jamaican and half UK. So we noticed we all had different perspectives of being African and Black people throughout this diaspora life And however, we've all ended up in Australia at the exact same time, both volunteering and producing and hosting for shows like the hip hop show across Sin Media. What we found though was in Australia and New Zealand and a lot of these Western countries, they don't have an experience of Black people that exists outside of what they see on places like TV, through areas like hip hop, or even just like rap music and other areas. So we wanted to really expand that and add an African perspective, as well as the popularity of things like Afro beats and other sources of music during that time. We really wanted to say, hey, Africa is here, and the Black people don't only exist in America, because especially in Australia, there's this weird, I want to say, racial tension, I guess, that exists, where people don't want to be overstep their boundaries, which is understandable. But at the same time, we really wanted to say, hey, there's a line here between all Black people aren't a monolith. We want to acknowledge different aspects of that exist, and the different aspects that exist even within kids that come from Africa today, and the diaspora kids like us who grew up here on this side, primarily speaking English and being more disconnected from our family and our roots back home. So what we started off with was the Hot Sauce show. So our show was called Hot Sauce, and it ran across both Sin Media and Joy Radio throughout the years of 2018 through 2022. And it's transitioning into a new mode of podcasting in more recent years now across areas like Spotify, Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts as well. So what we really wanted to do was outline the experiences of Black and ethnic minority youth across the entire world through the voices of diaspora youth. And we thought our positioning as uni students as well was a very, very important voice and a very important aspect of that. As we are youthful, we do have that mentality, and that does make us some of the first people to have come into these countries, right, compared to our younger siblings or even our children that would be born in these countries. And we wanted to have a record and a documentation or an archive that would exist in later years when people come and say, oh, what were these people thinking in the past? What were the voices? What were the experiences of these young people as they first came and grew up in this area where we're starting to see these African communities, Black communities, ethnic minority communities really be birthed by not people that had come here as immigrants, but had been raised in this environment where they are aware of the fact that they're outside of the majority culture that exists within places like Australia and New Zealand and the UK, and it had to form their own communities with the other diaspora kids. And how is that going to change, and how is that going to evolve in more recent years, in the coming years, with both our descendants as well as our siblings, and what spaces can we create to support children and youth like us? In more recent years, that heart has been kept the same in my own personal work. But as I've shifted away and expanded towards things outside of the radio and podcasting sphere, I've moved towards areas like digital design. More recently, working with writers like Georgia Pisano, who has most recently created a PhD on design and waste. And then also with businesses like CMY, the Centre for Multicultural Youth in Melbourne, Australia, creating design systems and brand projects for things like Culture Spring. So Culture Spring, for example, is a project that is very near and dear to my heart because it very much aligns with the work that I was doing as a youth myself. And so they do very similar things in creating that through line for people like myself to create and connect with businesses and communities through the work that they do. And so it was very important that I had a hand in creating that. And that's something that I'm very, very proud of. So the work that I do now contains the very same essence of what I built when I was 18, 19 years old with my friends, Jenna Green and Elgin Naidu, and moving forwards with that and trying to keep that essence in every single piece of work that I do. Growing up in Australia as someone that is Zimbabwean, but also having that creative sphere as an immigrant youth is an experience that is strange, growing and transitioning into something like podcasting or an arts career, where when I was much younger, there was a lot of pressure from both my parents and other people in the Zimbabwean community, because obviously they've moved here to get a better life. They've said, okay, we're going to move from Zimbabwe to places like New Zealand, the UK, Australia. We want you to have the most opportunities. We want you to make the most of everything that you do. You Zimbabweans are a very tenacious people. If there's anything that we can take away from this podcast, and it's that we try 100% everything that we do. And so going to school was a big part, getting good grades, making sure that you're learning something and acquiring knowledge in the correct ways was something that was really hammered into me growing up. And growing up and finding a love for things like arts and podcasting was a very strange thing to pitch to your parents growing up, which was, I understand that I'm doing well in school and I have all of these goals, and you want me to go and study medicine and law and all of these different things, business. But having a skill as I did, a talent in storytelling, telling stories and communicating with people of all different types, really it threw my parents for a loop, because it took a while for them to understand that this was something that not necessarily was something that was going to waste their time, or oh, we failed as parents, we wanted to have a kid that was going to be successful and make money from what they do, to someone that tells stories and highlights people and uplifts people in their community. And so there's a weird dynamic where when you have that kind of sense of there's a very high pressure to succeed in our community, I feel like, especially as a Gen 1 immigrant, so someone that's just come here, versus someone like my little brother who has had myself try and pave the path. And that was what we started with Hot Sauce, was we wanted to be the forefront of the community and say, hey, look, as Zimbabweans, as Africans, as people from the diaspora, as Gen 1 immigrants, we don't have to stick to things that are going to guarantee success, or things that are going to guarantee monetary wealth, like law, like dentistry, like medicine, all of those things. But we wanted to say, hey, look, you can find a passion in doing something that you want to do. You can highlight stories of other people within our community. We need to build healthy spaces that we can connect and grow and become our own economy of sorts. And we need to acknowledge that it's not just our assimilation into a culture. We need to actually embrace our identity that exists in the places that we populate. So it's not as simple as just living in Melbourne and becoming one with the people that are in Melbourne. We need to have our spaces. We need to have places that we can connect. We need to be able to talk to people and say, hey, look, this is my community here. How can I connect with your community here, without just being on an individual basis? As well as it makes it easier for people when they come from our home countries, that they're still coming now, to say, I have a place here in Melbourne, both in the arts field, both in technology, both in medicine, in whichever area that they choose to. We need to build these areas instead of primarily focusing on guaranteed success, if that makes any kind of sense. Not to talk down on our community. I think it's very, very great that we work so hard and focus so much energy into really, really striving hard. And it's a lot to say, because when you grow up, you see a lot of African doctors, a lot of African medical professionals who are very, very highly educated people. But what happens, I believe, is that we focus a lot on this highly educated sphere of people without really acknowledging the work of the people like Gertrude here, who is uplifting our voices and connecting these people without necessarily being first and forefront in things like medicine, being out here in the theater rooms and helping people, or the courts, really fighting for people. They are fighting for people in a different way. They're putting the voices up here. They're connecting people to businesses, to communities, to arts. They're really building the groundwork for our communities to feel safe where we are, through the work that they do, especially with Diversity Connector, as well as hearing Gertrude's story across the TED Talks is fantastic, because it's very much like my own story, where we're trying to build something in our community for our community, but from ground zero. There's no one else here, so we have to reach out and get help from everyone else, different people from different ethnicities, from different community backgrounds, from different cultures, to try and build our own situation, while we bring people from our home country to unite us into a better community.
Wow, Ndaba, what an amazing story for such a young man. You have done a lot in your young life. And like you, I started my journey in New Zealand. So you probably would have landed around the same time that I did with my
Uh-huh.
kids. It's a long way to come from Zimbabwe.
Yeah.
Now, do share with us the inspiration hot sauce. What was it that made you say, this is what I want to do? This is what I'm going to call it? And yeah, tell us a little bit about that.
So that was born from the back in 2018 and 19, there was a push between music and culture, both in Australia and worldwide, where we're almost seeing a lens shift, or the lens was expanding in the realm of culture between American culture expanding outwards from what existed currently between hip hop and rap music, which was what we worked on in Sin Radio through the hip hop show, and expanding outwards towards expanding different Black views across the world. So places like Africa was a huge focus in 2018 and 19. Places like Jamaica and the Caribbean, Trinidad, Tobago, and Guyana, where it was very much, we really wanted to expand and say, look, there's a different perspective here that exists outside of the traditional rap and hip hop that everyone thinks of when you think of Black
Yeah.
inspired music. And so Hot Sauce was a way for us to kind of uplift those stories and say, hey, look, here is an artist that we grew up listening to, or here's a new artist that speaks our native tongue, or here's an artist that takes a sound from the Caribbean, or here takes a sound from Nigeria or South Africa, and really push it to people and expand their audio abilities. Hot Sauce was a way for us to cheekily be like, here's a bit of spice into your life. So having a little bit of spice, a little bit of excitement into the regular monotony that existed between hip hop, as we felt it was getting just a little bit stale at the time. And
Yeah.
so at the point in time, we had a lot of friends that were DJs as well. And so we were like pushing this. If you are familiar with Amapiano in South Africa or Zimbabwe,
Yes.
we really wanted to push that because we knew our cousins were listening to that back at home, but we would go out and hear just regular hip hop and rap. And so we were like, well, we need people to be able to hear these different sounds from different worlds, but how are we going to get this out into the community? So we connected with our DJs, we connected with our event organizers and said, hey, can we play this? And then put that on our radio show. So wherever you heard it, it was everywhere. And then now look, 5 years later, Amapiano is rampant
Amazing.
and it's everywhere.
Yeah, it's global now. That is just fascinating. So the transition from a radio show to a podcast can be significant. Can you describe the most challenging aspects of the change and how you've navigated them, especially during the pandemic?
The pandemic was a huge, huge factor for it all. So we all really enjoyed the aspect of being in the studio with the radio, as we had all of the equipment, we had all of the setup, we had the screens and everything. The issue was Jenna, obviously, our other co-host. So out of the three of us, myself, Elgin, and Jenna was from the UK. So we knew in the near distant future that she wasn't going to be here in Australia forever and ever. So we had to establish systems from pretty early onwards that we would be able to communicate with her and be able to set up the show in a way that we can still have it be smoothly running even while she's in the UK. And then COVID and the pandemic really speed tracked that process to another
Yes.
level. We had hit 2019 and we had just finished working on Joy Radio. And then I went to South Africa to go and visit family and really connect with everything there, and came back. And then we were in lockdown, which was something. So we had to scramble and rush to get all of our materials and say, okay, how are we going to set up these home studios? Jenna's gone back to the UK. And so we've had to find a way that we can connect. And so a lot of our first initial recordings were done through things like Zoom, or even just the silly way of recording our voices on the topic on a phone call, having two microphones before we had everything set up, which was a funny situation. But it was a challenge for sure. But I think we got there in the end, thank God.
It sounds like you made it fun. So, as a communication designer, how did your background contribute to the branding and visual identity of Hot Sauce? And can you give us examples of how design influenced the listener engagement?
Oh, Hot Sauce was my first project actually as a digital designer. So back when I was doing hot sauce, I was currently studying a degree of biomedical science, which was a huge shift in my life, I guess. So when I went to go study that degree, I was like, okay, cool, I'll be a doctor. It's calm. And then my friend connected us to this radio opportunity, and that's where I started to build out